So this video is about the industrial period, which runs from 1750 to 1900. There's lots and lots of change that happens in this period, and not just with crime, law enforcement and punishment, but the time period itself. This is when factories are emerging, towns are growing, and all of these different changes in Britain have an impact on crime, law enforcement and punishment. One of the key things in crime is that there is a rise in the amount of crime from the early 1800s. Petty theft is still the most common crime, with 80% of all crimes being crimes of petty theft. So stealing something of low value. One of the reasons why this is most common, and also why the crime rate increases, is due to a huge increase in population. There's less food, less jobs, people become more desperate and steal. So increase in population, less food, less jobs, desperation. There is also, however, the growth of towns. Towns become more crowded, which means there is more opportunity for theft. There are also a number of new crimes that emerge in this period, such as fare dodging. And this is where you avoid paying for the train. This becomes a crime in this time period due to the increase in train travel. So a whole network of railway is created across Britain. And people use it all the time. Another new crime that you see in this time period is not sending children to school. In 1870, the Education Act was passed, which made school compulsory for all children under the age of 10. That meant that you could then be charged with the crime if you did not send your children to school. Probably the biggest area of change in this time period is law enforcement. Now, between from 1750 to round about the early 1800s, law enforcement in towns stays the same. So there's the use of watchmen from the early modern period and constables. So that is a continuation of early modern period methods. If you can't remember what they are, skip back through the video, go back to the early modern period and have a look at what the watchmen and constables do to keep people safe. However, in the industrial period, they become ineffective. And that is due to the increase of the urban population. So the more people live in towns, the less effective watchmen and constables become. So due to the increase in the urban population. The industrial period is where we see for the first time an introduction of a professional police force. But prior to that, in the 1750s, there is the creation of a group called the Bow Street Runners. And these are set up by John Fielding, who is a magistrate, so like a JP, at Bow Street Court. And he introduces them basically just to patrol the main streets of London, around where his courthouse is. Now, they are paid, but they still aren't a professional police force recognised by the government. But by 1800, there is 68 Bow Street Runners. Now, people are concerned about crime at this time. They are concerned about law enforcement. In particular, they've been having a look at what has been happening over in France, where there's been like a revolution and things. So they're a little bit concerned that that might happen in Britain. And eventually, the government agrees that a police force is needed. So in 1829, we have the creation of the Metropolitan Police Force. And these are created by Robert Peel. Why are they introduced? As I said before, linking to the constables and the watchmen, is the increased urban population, which makes older methods ineffective. There is that concern about the rise in crime rate in the early 1800s. And there is a fear of revolution, so people rising up to try and take down the government, like in France. Now, as we say, though, you do try to have, maybe 3 points for each of the topics. However, the police force does develop a little bit from 1829, so just want to add one of those in. So the police force is created in 1825, and then in 1835, there is the Municipal Corporation Act. And that means towns can then set up their own police force. So the 1829 one very much centred around London, but 1835 towns can create a police force. Now, there is a lot more detail on the police force, so if you do want to have a look at something else, obviously if you've been given some of the crime and punishment booklets, you'll find it in the industrial period. Or if you do want to have a look at the revision website, there's also some extra bits on there, so on the school website. But one extra thing let's add in about the police, just kind of after 1850, is that from 1867, they start to use technology such as telegraphs, used to speed up communications. I definitely should have done this on an A3 piece of paper. If you are finding this too small, do just get an A3 piece of paper. So not only are the developments in law enforcement, there's also lots and lots of developments in punishment. This is a time when people's attitudes are changing. They're starting to think that, there's humanitarian ideas. We should care about people a little bit more. Should we reform criminals rather than actually just punishing them and killing them like the bloody code did in the previous period? So one of the new punishments that's introduced in the early modern period, but actually gets a lot bigger in the industrial period, is transportation. And this is sending criminals to another country to work instead of execution. Now, before 1750, transportation had been taking place to America. It's not used as much as the transportation in the industrial period, but that actually ends in 1776. So transportation to America ends in 1776. And that's due to the American War of Independence. So America's gained independence from Britain. So actually, we can't now send the criminals there because they're no longer part of Britain. The British government needs something else. They still want to use transportation. So in 1787, the first transportation to Australia happens. Between 1787 and 1868, 160,000 people are transported. 80% of these people had actually committed a petty crime, most of them petty theft. And you could be transported for 7, 14 years, or life, dependent on your crime. It also ends in the industrial period in 1868, and that's due to a number of different objections, including objections by the Australian government, and British taxpayers, because they are having to, one, foot the bill for transportation, and two, take care of the families of people that had been transported. Not only is there changes in new crimes like transportation, but there's also changes to execution. In the 1780s, executions are moved inside prisons. Why? Well, it had always been that executions were done publicly as a way to deter any further criminals, but actually the government starts to become concerned about rowdy behaviour on hanging days. Almost creating more crime on hanging days. People not really seeing it as a deterrent, actually seeing it as a kind of day out where you take the family in a little picnic. Then there's more crimes and fights, so it becomes more of a problem. There is also 2 new methods of execution introduced. We've got the new drop and also the long drop. And these are introduced as quicker, more humane methods of execution. So quicker, more humane methods of execution. I've just had to pause for a second, get another piece of paper because I've run out of space. If you do need some more paper, feel free to pause, grab some paper. Because prisons is quite a big one actually. So prior to the industrial period, prisons have been used for keeping people before trial, people are in debt, and the conditions in prisons in 1750 are poor. Really, really poor. So we've got large groups sharing one cell. All classes of criminals together. And that's a problem really, because people who've gone in for something quite minor are then with more criminals who commit more organised and more serious crime, and they can actually then becomes almost like a criminal school. So people are leaving a worse criminal than they were before. There's also poor sanitation, so disease is absolutely rife. So, for example, you've got jail fever, which is typhus, and it comes from the poor sanitation in prisons. Now, in this period, you get two prison reformers in particular who we learnt about. That's Elizabeth Fry and John Howard. Now, you could possibly get a question just on prisons. The biggest changes to prisons happened in the 20th century, for example. So you'd need to know these industrial prison examples, 20th century examples. You could even possibly argue with the introduction of bridewells. Actually, that's when the prison today as we know it starts. So, I've seen questions before just on prisons. So we've got Elizabeth Fry and John Howard. So Elizabeth Fry, she visits Newgate Prison, the women's section, and she persuades the authorities there to separate the women into groups of 12 based on their offence. And they're also encouraged to read the Bible, sew and knit. We also have John Howard. Now, John Howard is actually part of local government in Bedfordshire. He's the High Sheriff. And he gives evidence in Parliament in 1774 to support two new laws. And it's all based on his experiences of what he's seen when going into prison. First one was the Discharged Prisoners Act. And this removes the need to pay to leave prison. So there would be a fee to be let out of prison. And the reason why they remove that is because lots of people can't afford to pay the fee. So actually they end up stuck in prison, even though they've served their sentence. And then there's also the Health of Prisoners Act. And this law said that all prisons needed to be cleaned and whitewashed regularly. So like repainted the walls. Now, after these reforms, there's then further changes to prisons. The government kind of realises that the prisons that they've got, they're not sufficient, they're not good enough. So in 1811, they begin construction of a new prison called Millbank. Now, unfortunately for the government, this construction is an absolute disaster, and they stop building new prisons. So instead, they try to reform the old ones, so make them better. Again, they do this by bringing in a new law in 1823 called the Jails Act. Now remember, this is the Old English spelling for jails. Nowadays we call them prison, or jail is the American one, if you're thinking of that that's the American spelling, Jail. So make sure you're using this GAOLS one, or prison. And the Jails Act had a number of different things included, but things such as female prisoners should be supervised by female wardens. That chaplains, so it's like priests, should visit prisons regularly. And also there should be doctors that visit prisons. Now, unfortunately, a lot of the law was ignored, to be honest, and because it costs money. Lots of the early prisons were like private enterprises, so people made money from them. However, linked to transportation that we looked at previously, the decline of transportation in the 1840s leads to a new wave of prison building. So there's 90 new prisons by 1877. So we've got transportation declining, we've got changes to execution. In the industrial period, prison starts to become the main punishment in this period. So many of these new prisons use something called the separate system. And this is based on a system first used in America. So separate system originates in America. Prisoners are kept in separate cells. And the idea is that they spend their time in there working, praying, and reflecting on their crime. They are only allowed to leave their cell for church services once a week and exercise. Now, even when they leave their cell, church services and exercise, they're kept very, very separate from other prisoners. And one of the problems that this leads to is extreme loneliness, which leads to a lot of mental health problems and a rise in suicides in prison. The separate system is also very expensive. So the government tries to come up with a solution, and their solution for this from around about the 1850s is the silent system. The idea is that prisoners work together but in silence. They're often given pointless work to do, such as walking on the treadmill or turning the crank. The idea is meant to be that the work is so pointless, prison is almost so boring, that people don't want to come back. So it's meant to deter reoffenders. So even still in this period, despite the fact that there's lots and lots of changes to how prisons work, they are still either used to remove or deter reoffenders. And this actually gets even more of a focus from 1865 with the Prisons Act, when they introduce hard labour, hard food, and hard board. So that's strenuous, pointless work, monotonous food, and beds that are hard wooden planks. Strenuous, pointless work, boring food, beds made from wood. So we'll move on to 20th century in a minute, and this is where you'll see the change in prison to what we know today, which it starts to focus on more reforming criminals so that they no longer that they can leave prison and not be criminals anymore.